Welcome to Stampscaping 101. We're going to be finishing off another stamp sketch here, featuring a stamp sketch that was created using the imagery from Nature Set number 29. The new deciduous types of foliage stamps, this one using the maple iconography, but done so with springtime colors. Okay, we always see maple leaves done in their full kind of fall splendor, but there's always the option of doing them in greens and following a springtime palette here. So in the leaves themselves, I utilized some different values and tones of green. We went with some lighter greens and some warmer greens, as well as the kind of the foundational darker neutral green. And you can watch that in the stamp sketching video here, but here we're going to finish it off. And I'm just kind of pointing out there that there's some deciduous trees within that maple brook image, and we're going to start off here using some of the antique linen distress ink. It's a very light kind of warm tone, and it's a good foundation color. Okay, now right here I'm just giving kind of a demonstration, or not a demonstration, but just kind of a representation of the type of lighting scheme that we're going to be using in this scene. Okay, so we have that area above the tree line and below the leaves, and that will be my source of light source. And then in that water area down below, what we'll do is we'll retain the lightness, or much of the lightness, white of the paper in this case, during the process of adding the tone. Therefore, we'll have an area that's light in the sky and an area of reflected light down below. Okay, now that's kind of a lighting scheme that you can really use. If you wanted to use it on 100% of your scenes, you could. I probably use it on, I don't know, at least 95% of all my scenes. I have an area of light that I retain somewhere in the sky, and then I have an area of light down below. Now, on a quarter-page card, it's usually centered like that, light, and then we have the darkness in between and light below, okay? But if you're doing something like a slimline card or a half-page card, bookmarks, whatever, something a little bit more elongated, you can even do kind of a diagonal type of structuring of your lighting. You can have your light source in the upper left-hand corner and your reflected light somewhere in the lower right-hand corner, something like that. You know, you can play around with these. Light sources could be smaller than the reflected light. The light source could be larger than the reflected light. It's whatever you really want it to do. But you have two areas, and what they are is they're just separated by either tone or objects. In this case, it'll be both, with some tone applied into that autumn brook. Okay? All right, so we used the antique linen. Now we're going into the mustard seed distress ink. Just going a little bit darker, kind of adding a warmer tinge to the composition and color scheme here. And we won't go too dark in this piece. One of the things I'm kind of discovering with these larger types of foliage in the foreground is that I'm finding I don't have to tone so much, because the leaves themselves provide so much of the perimeter values in terms of darker values to create that strong vignette. And a nice vignette provides a nice framing device for our composition here. So I don't know, with so many leaves in there that are already dark green, and I don't know if I used some black impressions up there. I might have. But there's not a whole lot that we really have to do. I mean, you don't have to do anything if you don't want to, but you'll still have this nice strong vignette provided by those leaf impressions. Okay, now one of the most important things is now I'm into the walnut stain color, and it's kind of a medium tone brown. It's not too dark. But one of the things, when you get into these darker colors, just remember to retain your lighter areas of both that light source and reflected light. But see, now I got into that walnut stain there, and you see how that light, especially on the waters surface, it really looks like it's kind of reflective of the lighting coming from above. Okay, now I'm using some peeled paint here, which is a green, kind of an aged green tinge. Now, see there's some areas in my trees that I'm retaining the white of. Now, you don't have to retain all of it, but because we'll use some colored pencils coming up here, but you want to retain some light areas within your objects usually. It doesn't really matter where, just as long as you retain some. I mean, you could color it all in, but just having some of that lighting in there, it creates a more varied surface. And when you have a more varied surface in terms of maybe colors, shadows, shadows and light, and maybe even intensity of ink, you create a more varied surface. But the easiest thing to do is just to leave some areas light and apply some areas and make them darker, so you can play around with value. Okay, there's other aspects to color, but if you get your lighting down and just oscillate it, and remember there's not kind of a fixed area in which it has to be, you just don't, all it is just not coloring everything equally. Leave some things a little bit lighter and leave some things darker. So I'm pointing out right here that I've already have some shadows and light in the design itself, and all you have to do is follow suit. Okay, so I'm going with a darker green. I'm applying that to the darker areas of the stamp. Okay, now if the stamp design is light in some areas, maybe don't apply too much of the darker tones to it. Okay, so you can just follow what has already been established within the design. Now there's always going to be variation, but that's just kind of a starting point for anyone. And I still follow it myself. But you can alter from it. But if you don't know what to do or where to color or where to shade, just look at the design and look for the darker areas and just follow that as your guide. Okay, now I'm kind of coloring in with some darker tones in those shadow areas, and I'll also start to apply that darker green on the perimeter, and then I'll go into a black, actually a black colored pencil as well. But you can see there's a lot of variation within those little kind of bushes within the autumn brook. Okay, now see this is black, and I'm coloring in some of those areas that are within the design that are shadows within there. And I'm just showing here, right here, where I've added in some applications of blue within this previous scene that I just did. So talking about variation, kind of going with streaks in some areas. Okay, so this is the difference between coloring and lighting at the same time, and just coloring. Coloring is where you just kind of fill in an existing space pretty much equally. Okay, but coloring and lighting at the same time means that you're just not coloring everything completely. Okay, like that in that water, I'm adding color into it, but I just don't, I'm adding kind of the darker areas of color, in this case on the perimeter, but you just leave the interior as is. Okay, that means in terms of an application aspect of it, believe it or not, it means you're doing less work, right? Because you're not filling in everything. Like someone that would be coloring in that water might be kind of feel inclined to fill in the whole thing with, let's say, blue or something like that. But in this case, in these warm toned, I don't know, maybe dusk, or I don't know if it's sunset, but you're just not filling in that whole area. You're kind of, I filled in quite a bit of it with that antique linen, but just with the darker tones, medium and darker tones, it's, for the most part in the shadows. So there we have created the illusion of light, and that's just by simply not coloring it all out. So less work, believe it or not. Less work, but kind of for a more effective, in this case, value range or lighting scheme. Okay, we've added the kayaker side there. When we do that kind of little spotlit area, it's really a perfect opportunity for some kind of subject matter. You can put, if it's in a meadow or something like that, you can put people or animals or something like that. Whatever you want it to be. If you have a floral type of image, you could put it down there, or it could be a cabin somewhere. Anything that you want your viewer to kind of fall on as a visual focal point is perfect within that spotlit area, or you can call it reflected light area, which a spotlit area is. Okay, so I'm just showing some different greens here, all the way to white. In terms of the application of kind of more detailed lighting. Okay, now, this is kind of a medium tone green. It's not a light green, but it is a lighter green in areas that are already darker than it, okay? So it just barely shows up in an area that's colored about the same value, but when I move it into my darker areas and put some of those dots in those areas that are darker, you know, probably has some walnut stain, maybe some black in there, this medium tone green stands out, okay? So I'm adding, you might say, some highlights in the darker areas of the piece. Now I'm going, here's a lighter green here. The lighter green, it's a little bit more of a warmer lighter green with that yellow in the green. And we'll apply some of this. And I can apply this one in the lighter areas of the scene because this is lighter than the darker green, okay? Now if I applied that light green on white, it's going to be darker than white, therefore it'd be more of a shadow than a highlight. So highlights are anything, you know, that you apply over the top of anything that's darker than it, okay? So it's not just an inherently light color, because it's just relative to what you're applying it over the top of. Okay, so I'm applying it in here. Some of the areas are darker than it, where it stands out as a highlight, but some of the areas it just looks as like texture. Okay, now white is going to be the lightest color that we'll use here. And I'm just pointing out again, see those highlighted areas, those lit areas within the scene. I'm just going to go in and kind of reclaim at least the tops of those areas, okay? So again, I'm just referencing the design, and I'm seeing where some areas are light within there, and I'm just going in and reiterating it, okay? I don't have to invent anything. It's in the designs already. There are light areas, but of course we've toned over them. So I'm not trying to just make them completely white again, but I am kind of reinforcing at least the edge, the top edge of those kind of bushes or grassy areas underneath the trees. Okay, now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of bring out my tree trunks a little bit. And there are, in the design, highlights on the sides of my tree trunks. So I'm going and reiterating that with the white paint pen. Now, see, it just wouldn't have been practical to mask all that off and to retain all those white tree trunks, you know, when I started coloring, but it's easy just to go back and reclaim those little highlights on the sides of those trees, and it takes you 5 seconds or something like that, you know, to do. Okay, now this is a water scene, so I'm going to go in and redefine that lightness of the tree trunks in the reflected area within the water, okay? So you see, that really kind of makes the area in the reflection and above water, it makes it real three-dimensional when you pull it out like that with the white pen. You can use a white gel pen if you want to. Just anything that's going to work for you. This one happens to be a 0.7 millimeter acrylic paint pen. Okay, I thought, well, that looked pretty good on those trees. Maybe I'll kind of define some of these maple leaf stems a little bit more and bring a little bit more of a three-dimensional type of look into those, that cluster of leaves hanging from above. See that? I just kind of draw right on that line a little bit. So what we have now, with the use of those paint pens, is crisp highlighting. Okay, it's little beads of white, which represents little reflected kind of areas of light being reflected back. They call it specular light, not spectacular light, specular light. It's light that's brighter than white. So anything that's kind of reflective of lighting, be it natural or man-made or whatever, there's highlights over everything that's probably on your desk right now, your pens and everything like that, reflecting light coming from your computer screen. That's specular light, okay? Now I'm creating that with the use of gel pens. But right here, I'm doing something from a textural standpoint that's almost the opposite of those paint pens, and just applying some ink with my cotton ball and just using white pigment ink, okay? So you can see that right in there. Doesn't that create a lot of kind of soft lighting within those leaves, and it pushes them back into as far as distance goes, though, too, doesn't it? Now see that distant part of my autumn brook, I'm just applying some pigment ink over that, those more distant trees, and doesn't it look like light is kind of hitting not only the trees, but maybe some fog in between us and those background trees, making the impression look more kind of three-dimensional, because some of it is being illuminated and some of it isn't. Okay, so that's an important part of this application right here. See, it takes me like 20 taps just to get that little bit of a glowing kind of light within there. Everyone that kind of tries this for the first time, a lot of times, first of all, your pigment ink pads are really super juicy because people don't use them very often. I use mine all the time for this purpose, but if you haven't been using them, you might pull a pigment ink pad that you haven't used for 10 years and it's still sopping wet, with pigment ink in there. It's just so juicy. So it's really important to kind of think about the process of adding this to your pieces as kind of more of a dry brushing type of application, meaning you want to achieve the application, layering quantity very slowly, okay? So through multiple taps, and then you'll have a lot of control over it, okay? Sometimes people, they just ink up their cotton ball and they just go, with straight into their scene, and it's this big glob of almost the equivalent of paint, okay? But right here, what I'm showing right there is just the oscillation of the application of that. So I've added some in some areas, then I won't do it in the next area, but then I'll apply it in another area. So it's kind of going soft, crisp, soft, crisp. And it doesn't matter where you put it, but just in general, I like to apply it where light meets dark. Okay, so I don't start applying it on the outer perimeter of this scene. I usually apply it somewhere where there's lighting, and then I kind of tap it into the objects that are next to it. And that's where it's really the most effective, because that's supposed to be where lighting is going to be the most prominent. Okay, so right there I just did a quick cut, and we're going to format this card. I don't format all my cards, but I really should, because it makes them look so much better, and it gives you the gist of, what, the finished product should really be anyway. Alright, so just applying some tape runner here, and I'm going to attach this piece to this piece of Aspire Patalics. It's a little bit of an iridescent paper. And I just eyeball it here. I didn't get my trimming perfect on this one, but who cares? Alright, I like to do a real kind of thin border around my pieces. That thin border kind of, I don't know, it mimics the things that happened with the white acrylic paint pen, just kind of white dots, or something roughly about like that. So I thought it would look good like that. And it would probably be good to contrast that green that's happening in the scene from the card, but this just happens to be a card that I already had. I have packs of these pre-folded cards that I've bought over the years on clearance over at Kelly Paper. But I thought, okay, I'm hardly ever using these green pre-folded cards. Why don't we just use it on this one? So it really matches the scene. Usually I'd like to provide a little bit more of a contrast, be it something darker or lighter, or just a different color, like black or something like that. But I think this looks pretty good. Okay, so I'm thinking I like that stamping word stamp of peace in my previous scene. So I was looking at kind of some opportunities around in here. Now, I like stamping out my word stamps a lot of times, not all the times, but a lot in reversed out text, so it's usually something in white over something darker. So I was just hoping that my background would be dark enough where stamping a word would stand out enough. It kind of gets a little bit buried when I do this here, but I think it looks okay. I mean, it is still, legible if you're looking at it. I don't know. Embossing in white or something like that might have been better. I don't know. It's definitely incorporated into the scene by kind of being a lot more translucent, and it's kind of in that kind of busy perimeter. Like I said, I usually like to go with something like this over something that's darker, but oh, so be it. All right, so just eyeballing it, not doing any kind of positioning. Kind of holding it down a little bit for the ink to transfer. I might have pressed too hard on this one because I am pressing into, there's a lot of wax from the colored pencils underneath here, so I think a lot of the ink didn't transfer as much as it could. So anyways, but there's your dream. It's a hidden dream maybe, but it is there. Okay, so that is it. Now, one of the things that I would do on this piece is to spray seal it with an acrylic spray. In this case, I think I'm going to spray, because I stamped this on kind of a more of a satin type of finish, not on a glossy cardstock, which I often do, but on this one I just kept it all silk, satin, dull, that type of lightly coated cardstock. It has kind of a not so glossy feel to it because it's not supposed to, okay? So I'll spray it with a workable fixative, which is kind of more of a neutral type of spray. It kind of sprays, I guess, like in a satin type of finish to it, but it has enough texture where you can still apply dry media over the top of it. But no, I'll spray with that one. But if you have a glossy cardstock, a glossy spray, you certainly use that one too. But if you don't want it to look glossy, then just give it a little bit of a spray from distance where you don't coat it too much, where it would turn kind of your more satiny type of finish into a glossy one. But by spraying too, what you'll do is you'll find that all of your colors will become a little bit more saturated than what they look like when they're dry. Give it a light coating so that you don't kind of eradicate all of your kind of misty look, okay? If that happens, you can just apply some additional pigment ink, white pigment ink, over the top of the spray sealed finished work, okay? Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the scene, and thank you so much for watching the video. We'll see you on the next video to come along.